All right, I don't mean to cut into conversation, but I think it's time to start. And my name is Brianne Murphy. I'm the director of the library here at Hendrix. I've been here for 25 years. I don't think Hendrix is going to give me a gold watch, unfortunately. But really happy to have you all here today. This topic is just all librarians have been talking about for about the last year. So we've been consumed with it. And I think we need to kind of take it out to everybody else and have you all join in the conversation because it's such an important issue and it's such an important constitutional issue, really. So you saw the snacks back there. If you need restrooms, they're kind of all the way at the other side of the library. And yeah, we'll just get started. I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists. And we grateful that they are here today. We had somebody who came all the way from Hot Springs, so that was the furthest. And we have people here who've driven a long way as well, so we appreciate everybody being here today. So I'm going to just briefly introduce them, and then we'll kind of kick off some questions, and of course we'll allow time for your questions, so be thinking as you're sitting here. We really want to get your perspective as well and have your questions addressed by the panel. So I will start with Jonathan Hancock, who is right here, is an associate professor of history and chair of the history department here at Hendrix. His research and teaching are focused on early America and native North America. He's an author of Convulsed States, Earthquakes, Prophecy, and the Remaking of Early America. Sounds like a hot title to me. I think it's exciting. This was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2021. He's working on a new book about the history of Native American communities near Charleston, South Carolina. And here at Hendrix, he's developed a course about how Hendrix-related historians have studied the US Civil War and Reconstruction over time. The course grew out of an interest in examining the role of early 20th century Hendrix historians in constructing Confederate lost cause ideology in Arkansas. And then seated next to Dr. Hancock is Dr. Erin Shaw. She is an assistant professor for the Department of Leadership Studies at the University of Central Arkansas here in town and serves as the Library Science and Information Technologies Program Coordinator. So she's in charge of creating school librarians, basically. She earned her doctorate in instructional design and technology from the University of Memphis. She has served in K-12 education for 24 years. We're about equal, maybe. As both a classroom teacher and a school librarian, and has been an online instructor at UCA since 2011. Dr. Shaw is a National Board Certified School Librarian and received the Arkansas Association of Instructional Media's AIMS School Library Media Specialist of the Year Award in 2014. The Pat McDonald Individual Achievement Award in 2016, and the Herb Lawrence Leadership Award in 2021. All right, and then finally, Adam Webb is the Executive Director of the Garland County Library and President of Advocates for All Arkansas Libraries, or all. He earned his master's in library science at the University of North Texas and his certified public library administrator certification from the University of Illinois. He has been at the Garland County Library for the past 15 years. Adam is a lifelong Arkansawyer and lives in Hot Springs with his wife, Jamie, his son, Atticus, and 3 dogs. All right. So, without further ado, the first question that I'd like to ask you all, I think each of you can jump in and answer this, is what does intellectual freedom mean for you? What is your own definition? And maybe give an example of the role of a school, public, academic, or other library played in exercising this freedom. So.
I'll go. For me, intellectual freedom is inherently tied with your First Amendment rights. Intellectual freedom is something that is granted upon you as an American, which allows you the freedom to read what you want, to think what you want, and to view what you want without government interference. It is the bedrock of a democratic society. You hear a lot of people who talk about they came to America because they came from oppressive governments who don't let you think what you want, don't let you worship what you want, or not worship what you don't want, and say and think what you want. So intellectual freedom is very much an American concept. It's one that is ingrained in us. It is a blessing that we all have it. And from a library's perspective, at least a public librarian's perspective, intellectual freedom is the corollary to freedom of speech. So you have freedom of speech, and you also have the right to receive information. That is something that has been ruled on by the U.S. Supreme Court and lower courts multiple times over the decades. Those concepts go back almost 100 years as far as case law in the United States goes, as far as intellectual freedom. And the library is a place, it is really the main place where this plays out, because your right to free speech really only extends to government action. So the government can't tell someone what to do as opposed to a private business or a private exercise. You know, Barnes & Noble can say, we don't want these books on the shelf, or you can say, I don't like that, but the government can't say, you can't read this book. And if we have it on the shelf in the library, we've made a determination, not we as librarians, but as a society have determined this is not obscene, it's not something that isn't constitutionally protected speech, and it's your right to be able to read it. So we're the gatekeepers. I know libraries don't like to talk about themselves as being gatekeepers of access to information, but we are definitely the place that holds information and makes it available to the public.
Thank you. Well said. So from a school library perspective, I completely agree. In our school libraries, intellectual freedom for our kids, it differs, at an elementary school compared to a middle school, compared to a high school, but you are should have various viewpoints of multiple topics, whether you are comfortable with them or not, appropriate resources for those students to have a safe space to learn all viewpoints. So you asked about, an example. So I inherited a library. I got there in October. It was Bob Courtway Middle School. I had just I got released from it was a long story, from Morrilton High School, and I walked into this library. It was 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And I got there in October, second week of November, 3 books were challenged almost immediately. And I was like, oh, crumb cakes, I didn't buy these. I don't know what they're here for. So I had to sit down and think about, thankfully we had a challenge policy by law. All school libraries are supposed to have a challenge policy in place. So I sat down with the high school librarian and I was like, okay, what do I do? And it ended up being 3 books that it was a 6th grader who would check them out. They had these little green dots on them. If any of you guys remember Accelerated Reader, some people love it, some people hated it. Well, at Bob Courtway, only the 6th grade teachers had their students do Accelerated Reader. 7th and 8th grade, they were doing, different reading incentives and motivation. So this little 6th grader had picked up these 3 books because they had the green dots. And they looked interesting. One was a poetry book. I remember one was Sarah Dessen, which, 6th grade girl compared to an 8th grade girl. 8th grade girl, great. Sarah Dessen's fabulous. 6 might be a little mature for them, but I didn't really know this until later. And I can't even remember what the 3rd book was. Well, we went through the whole challenge process. The parent was involved. Thankfully, at first they were just taking everything out of context. But they went back and read the whole book, and we finally determined that the book was appropriate for the library. It just wasn't appropriate for his daughter. And so he was like, oh yeah, we will leave it in there. Thankfully, the whole committee decided that. But it was an opportunity for the parent to have a conversation with their son or daughter and say, here's what's right for you and not what's right for somebody else. So, we did take the green dots off. That was the other problem. The classroom teachers were just looking at the library books and they were like, oh, these all have an accelerated reader test. We didn't have, this was 20 years ago. So it was before you just bought one subscription and you got all of the tests. So they were like, we just need all of these have tests. And the librarian didn't converse with the teachers to say, well, some of these might not be appropriate for sixth graders. So she just bought all the tests. And so I think that was the other thing.
Yeah.
So they did pull those stickers off. And then I was told you have to put YA stickers on everything that's YA. So I did, and I also put some extra stickers on some that didn't even have a bad word in them, and kids read them and were like, why does this have a YA sticker on it? Didn't have, I'm like, well, did you like the book? Yes, I did. So I
They
thought,
gravitated to the words,
They
or the
did,
books that
that's-
have bad words in them.
that's what kids do, so I don't know. So that's my story, just one.
All right, thank you.
So as a history professor, and as a historian, to me, academic freedom means the freedom to follow historical evidence in the classroom and in research. And I realize as part of this conversation that I come from an incredibly privileged position as somebody who works at a private institution and who is tenured at a private institution. So I have that, those kind of safeguards. But one example of how intellectual freedom has been available to me at Hendrix is this course I teach about how Hendrix historians have interpreted the Civil War and Reconstruction over time. In an early 20th century context, it has the tendency to kind of let some skeletons out of the closet in terms of lost cause, racist ideology, and the kind of glorification of white supremacy and the Klan in Arkansas. So I feel entirely protected to offer a course like that to Hendrix students because I think it's important to grapple with the stakes of historical interpretation and to think about how major events and topics in American history get interpreted and reinterpreted over time, and how it's incumbent on every generation of Americans to engage in those interpretive exercises so that history education isn't just kind of memorizing names and dates, but endowing people with a sense of the importance of historical interpretation and historical thinking.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask you a question? I don't know,
You're allowed.
I'm not the moderator, but you know. So one of the issues as far as libraries go as repositories for information is the second that we start to make subjective decisions on what is and is not allowed in a library, that just unravels really quickly. And as a historian, what problems do you see in all of history is just built off of what has happened before it, you know, and that's kind of an obvious point to make. But the second the state starts telling you, you can't talk about this part of history, or you can't talk about this, because right now the conversation is just on sexually explicit material, but we know that the motives of the people who have started this movement are to really get rid of any viewpoint other than the one that they agree with. So I mean, what are the dangers there for students, for history as a whole?
Yeah, we were talking about this as a small group a couple of days ago to prep for this, but you know, my suspicion is that like the discussion of gender and sexuality in terms of banning books is kind of going to be in some ways maybe a Trojan horse and a wedge to start opening up into questions of race in particular, right? And so for me, I think it's really important to grapple with like what the state sanctioned as history in the early 20th century. You know, what were Arkansas public school students reading back then? And the answer is the president of Hendrix was writing a textbook. And I have a student here, Quentin Tolbert, who's more of an expert on these textbooks than I am, having done a senior research project on it. But you start to see that they have a very narrow understanding of who constitutes an American, right? And it's limited by race. So to argue that you want to keep politics out of history education, well, there was a particular kind of politics that was being inculcated in Arkansas students 100 years ago. And it's important to grapple with that and recognize that we need a wider spectrum of perspectives and to keep access to those materials from 100 years ago, but also like contextualize them and allow people to recognize like the stakes of where we are and how we don't want to go back to students learning what they were reading 100 years ago in American history. They can read that material, but I think they will be quickly shocked at how narrow an understanding of American history it conveys.
Good. All right. The next question has to do with librarians and how are librarians educated to prepare themselves for these types of issues, book challenges, free speech, censorship? And maybe if you could give some examples for school librarians in Arkansas. I think Dr. Shaw is going to be the one who addresses this. But
Yeah, we're one of the state, there's, not every state requires, first of all, that every school have a school library or a certified school librarian. Thankfully, Arkansas is one that does. All of us have a master's degree in library and information science. Now ours isn't necessarily ALA accredited. Those are the really good
that's
degrees.
the American Library Association.
It is.
It's got a lot of acronyms in our profession. So.
We, in Arkansas, we have 3 programs in the state that prepare school librarians specifically for Arkansas, but I've got students now across the nation because we went 100% online. But we're AASL, American Association of School Librarian recognized. Our program, there is one at Tech and then ASU in Magnolia. And all
SAU, yeah.
3 of ours, we require collection development courses where you go through how to create a selection policy, what different criteria are you going to look at, how to make sure that you have a challenge policy in place, that you have a good challenge policy, not just one that, says the principal can remove whatever. But we also talk about offering diverse perspectives, because I always go back to the 5 laws of S.R. Rangan. I can't say his name very well. Ranganathan. Every library a book, and every reader. No, every library a reader. Yeah. Every book a reader. Right. Every reader a book. And I think about every student in my library. I should have something for them, whether I, am on the same reading level or whatever. But I need to have something so students can see themselves, you talk about mirrors, they need to see themselves reflected in literature. And I know 20 years ago, I was not the librarian I would be now, and I didn't always offer the same perspective. I chose books I liked, so they were my perspective. And then I thought about it, and I thought, I'm missing a lot of kids. And so over the years, my practice has changed. But I think about, I had neurodivergent learners that were in the self-contained classrooms, and I didn't have any resources for them. They didn't even come to the library. So I needed to figure out, how was I going to reach every learner? And so, we talk about in ours, there is that soft censorship where you think, oh, are parents going to, come after me because I'm in a school? But thankfully I always had an advisory committee that would help me kind of go through the materials and make sure that it was right for my community. I didn't put the same materials at Bob Portway Middle School that I did at Greenbrier Middle School. I just had different kids. Same thing at Morrilton High School. I just, you have to follow your board selected policy, but I also had to learn not to, not to look at all, I had to look at all the viewpoints. And
so it's not the Wild West.
no,
Librarians are being educated how
we
to
actually,
do their
I
jobs.
know, we pay attention to things, and we really think about it. And when a challenge does come up, I do feel comfortable now. Like, I love that, we all sat down, read the book, we went through it to try to make sure it had literary merit for our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, not for, 6-year-olds or 12th graders, but this was my population. And so that was where we were.
And what about public librarians? How are they, is this any different when you?
Not particularly. Legality is legality wherever you go. What they teach in a school librarian program versus a public librarian program is all going to be the same stuff. It'd be the same if you took chemistry here versus at UCA. You're still going to learn the same periodic table. So the laws of our country don't apply very differently to school libraries as they do to publics, other than publics don't have as many restrictions as a school library. So even in some of the case law that dictates how libraries work, like Island Trees versus Pico, which is one of these big cases for libraries that talks about a student's right to be able to read books. Even in the dissent in that case, they said it's not government censorship to remove books from a school library because they're still available at the public library in your community. So the restrictions on a public library are far less than they are in a school library, particularly because we're not dealing with a specific age group in a public library. We're dealing from everybody from birth to death. And I'm serious. We had lap time, story time at the library today, at my library, and also the AARP was doing free tax help for elderly people. So, a public library, very much like Erin was saying, has to be a mirror of the community that you're in. And that knife cuts both ways, because I've had challenges at my library before, as a case in point, for someone who says you have too many books on Christianity and you're preferring one religion over another. And I've had a good response to that. I said, well, the majority of people who worship in Garland County are Christian, and of course our collection is going to reflect that reality. But that's not to say that I don't have books on Islam, and I don't have books on Buddhism, I don't have books on neo-paganism. I mean, as I said, we have to be a mirror to the community that we live in. And ultimately, that's the thing that I think has upset people so much over the last couple of years, is the library is a space where you are forced to get along with other people and accept other viewpoints. Additionally, the library is not indoctrinating anyone. We're taught this in library school, that your personal opinions as a librarian need to be left at the door when you go in to start ordering books for other people. When you're using their money to provide a service, you really need to make sure that you are taking your community's interest into consideration in your collection development, and making sure that you have material available to everyone. And because you have to get along with other people at the library and accept other viewpoints, for your viewpoint to also be valid, that seems to be something that it might be a bridge too far for a lot of people.
All right. So the recent challenges that we've seen in the last year or two, both in school and public library settings, I would say that academics just, you guys are grown-ups. So, and you're here for intellectual expansion. So I've never seen a challenge at this or anything on our shelves, ever. I've heard rumors that some people did come in and check out books and then not return them. That's a little tactic that people use, but that we just don't have the same issues to deal with as public and school librarians because of the age issue mainly. But how are these challenges in the last few years in schools and public libraries different from challenges Harry Potter? That was probably the most recent one I can think of in Arkansas that happened in the early 2000s, I think. Can you give maybe a little history lesson here for our folks? I mean, a brief history lesson about this and how this is different this time.
Got it.
Okay. The long and short of how this one is different from previous times is social media. I mean, that's my opinion on it. Our country has a very long history of challenging books for obscenity or for constitutional grounds, going back to, James Joyce was one of the first ones in a case called the United States versus one book called Ulysses. And that used to be, it still is actually, the process in which someone would challenge a material to determine whether it is obscene or not. And I'll take a brief detour there. I don't know if this is a question we're going to talk about later, but as far as constitutionally protected speech goes, there are only a few categories of speech that are not protected under the First Amendment. And everybody knows the definition of most of them. Mm-hmm. Child pornography, fighting words, defamation, and then obscenity, that's another one. But everybody knows what child porn is, and everybody knows what defamation is, and everybody knows what fighting words are. But not everybody knows what constitutionally or judicially determined obscenity is. There is a concept of what a person finds obscene and the concept of what a court would find obscene. And there's an ocean of difference between those two things. And the way that this round of book challenges seems to be different is people aren't challenging books because they are reading it, taking offense to it, and then challenging it because they find it that offensive. It's almost become meme culture. So you have a list of books that ranges from around 100 to, I think the largest one I've seen in Texas is 800 books. And that's the biggest list, which is still just a fraction of what even a medium-sized public library has on their shelves. But that list is shared with all of these groups on social media, and they say, go and challenge these books in your public library. They're harming children. They're sexualizing children. These people are groomers and they're pedophiles. And you need to go challenge these books in your library. And people are challenging material without having read them, without having applied any sort of standard of even what their own tastes are. They're just taking what people say and sharing it and reposting it, for lack of a better term. But it's left the internet and it has come into our actual lives. So now it's something that librarians have to deal with a lot more than we used to. In the first decade that I was a librarian, I might get a book challenge once a year. And they were easy enough to sit down with the person and say, you know, I understand you're upset. I understand you don't like this book. The library has a mandate to have stuff available for all sorts of different tastes and viewpoints. And every time I had that conversation with a member of the public, it was resolved then and there. And you know, I said, if you want some help on searching the catalog and finding more appropriate stuff, we'd be happy to sit down with you, because libraries are here to help. We're not here to harm children.
No.
We're not here to groom children sexually. I mean, both of those statements are absurd on their face, and nobody should take them seriously. But we do have this other duty to make sure that we have stuff available for everybody. And so that's the thing that's really different this time around for me, is you have people who are just challenging books because they're upset about it on the internet. And now they're bringing it in. And so now it's a problem for everybody nationwide.
Is that mirrored in schools too?
Yeah,
Did you say?
yeah, they're, yes, because now, so I think it started in the public libraries. There are these specific questions they call up as a concerned constituent to ask these. It's the same rhetoric each time, isn't it? Do you have this? Would you check out an X-rated movie to a 6-year-old? You know, just things. Or do you believe in the Library Bill of Rights? Do you? And so now they're starting to call schools, and because I'm on a listserv with a lot of school librarians. It's about 400 members, but I know in the state, I think we have about 800 school librarians, so it's about half. And now they're asking the librarian if they can get to them. Usually the librarian is teaching, so they end up talking to the principal, and the principal is like calling in the school librarian. Do we have a selection process? Do we have a challenge policy? Yeah, they're in your handbook. You know, the administrator doesn't always know that they were already board approved. And they're, you know, our online catalogs are public. You know, you can look up Greenboro Middle School's online catalog and you can look to see what's in there. So there are, you know, they are using these specific lists and targeting, and yeah, it's, I mean, it is definitely different, because I thought about that challenge that I went through, and that was 2003. And so, yeah, that was 20 years ago. And,
Yeah.
you know, this dad just happened to find these books and he was a little concerned. So
Right.
it wasn't, he wasn't, it really wasn't being mean. But one of the things that I always go back to about libraries, nobody is assigning this book to you to check out. And I don't know how to get that across. And I always taught my middle schoolers, especially. My high schoolers, they weren't checking books out anyway. I'm not gonna lie. They were coming in doing some research, but no, they weren't checking books out. But my middle schoolers were, and I always talked to them at the very beginning, because I had at the Greenboro one, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, 5th graders came from, you know, different elementary schools. So they had, one library might have 10,000 different materials and another one might have 8,000, but they had been there in kindergarten, first, second, you know, so they were tired of their library. And so they were like, ooh, we have 13,000 books and these are all like middle school. But I had to talk to them, you know, you may find a book that you're not comfortable with. It doesn't, you know, if it's got a wordy dirt in it, I don't know what to tell you. I didn't write the book. But if you're not comfortable and you don't think your parent would be comfortable with you reading it, check it back in. And so they did. I wrote one little girl on the Charlie May Simon list. That's one of the state book awards for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. They have to read 3 books, at least 3 on the list, and they can vote. And so it was a really good opportunity for me to teach the students about the privilege of voting, you know, having a voice. But we were talking about books, and they were like, "You mean we get to choose the winner?" I said, "Yes." Students in Arkansas, I said, "You know, the Newbery Award, you don't get to choose it. A committee chooses that, a committee of adults. It may or may not be the best book in the universe, but you know, you have this list of 12, and so I was book talking all of them, and there was one, it was great. It was For Freedom, the story of a French spy, and it was a historical fiction. It was about a ballet dancer. She ends up becoming a spy, I don't know, during World War II. But there is a scene where, you know, it's war, somebody got killed. And so she brought it back, and she was like, "Miss Shaw, this book is not for me." And I was like, "Sarah, turn it back in." I said, "We've got 11 other ones on there. Let's try this one instead." She was like, "Okay." So kids can make decisions too, and you can have good conversations with them. And I think that's where we're missing that piece.
Yeah.
And I had parents come in and they would check out with their kid. They could come before or after school, so.
All right. Well, poor Jonathan's kind of been
I know.
neglected with these questions. So we're gonna hit
His question.
the professor question here. So you have taught about race in teaching American history, and I want to know how your approach, if it's changed since you've been teaching for 10 years. So has your approach changed since you became a professor of history? And we maybe just start with that, and we'll kind of ask other questions about library collections after that.
Yeah, so I arrived 10 years ago as an early Americanist, and in some ways, you have a kind of privilege of distance and time from long ago, and that can sometimes insulate you from controversial topics. But I think that we've seen in the 10 years since I've been here, really kind of iconic moments in national debate and in the last 10 years of history surface where the stakes of historical interpretation meet violence, right? So I think of Dylan Roof in Charleston, flashing Confederate flags and then shooting up a church in downtown Charleston. The rallies in Charlottesville, right, that left a woman dead, among other kind of flashpoints. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, the way that historical monuments related to the Civil War, but not exclusively related to Civil War, right? People started gathering around monuments to Columbus or to Spanish colonial officials in the Southwest. So in some ways, selling students, and selling's not the best word, but getting students interested in the stakes of historical interpretation, I don't have to do as much of that kind of convincing these days, because this is part of the national conversation in ways that it hasn't been before. And in some ways, it kind of takes you by surprise as well, right? Another good example, I was thinking about Elizabeth Warren talking about Cherokee ancestry and the way that kind of floats into politics. So you and the 1619 Project with the New York Times, right? These things are floating through public culture. Hamilton, right? These are all kinds of things that are just occurring to me in the last 10 years where early American history kind of pops up, right? At least history through the US Civil War. So one of my points is to then take those kind of moments that students might be familiar with and then think about the difference between what a monument is supposed to be doing and opponents of taking down monuments or contextualizing monuments say monuments are history, right? But monuments tell you more about the history of the time in which they were created and commemorated than they do about the people that they're actually celebrating. So you have to do some work to kind of distinguish between history and historical education and then commemoration. But those cultures of commemoration and the debates that happen that can sometimes turn violent in the last 5 years or so become ways of getting students more engaged, right? I think they get it a little bit more, and that's helpful to use as kind of an entree into history courses.
Interesting. Well, probably a lot of you know that libraries, academic libraries, have some very controversial materials in their collections, or archives, such as, racist history texts, yearbooks that depict people in blackface. In our own, and I forgot to go get this yearbook, in our own archives, a troubadour from 1923, right? 23, depicts the KKK at Hendrix, kind of as a club. They're there, right, in black and white, right in front of you. So, this is harmful to our BIPOC population of students right now. But what do we do? So what do libraries and archives do with this material? Do we take it off the shelf to protect those students? Do we put it out there? I mean, this has come to light because of the digitization projects that libraries and archives have undertaken, which of course puts all of the dirty laundry out for the world to see. And so I don't know, what's your take on these potentially harmful materials, and how do you protect people but also tell the truth, I guess?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to materials like that, you wouldn't ever want to limit access, but you also wouldn't want to impose, particularly when it comes to visually disturbing materials or graphic descriptions of violence.
Mm-hmm.
My answer, I think, as historians, we always want context, right?
Right.
So incorporate some context into, just as you might a monument, into a yearbook photo.
Mm-hmm.
So contextualize that and also flag it and identify it for people, right? Give them a sense of what's coming,
Mm-hmm.
if in fact they are. And in some cases, I think you can allow students to opt out of some material.
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly wouldn't want that. And I feel the same way sometimes about statues that get taken down. I wish they were in museums where they were contextualized, right?
Right.
So that we're not just kind of burying the past and not owning up to it.
Right.
One particularly interesting dimension of this in terms of archives, and this is something that a lot of not only museums but historical archives are dealing with, is sacred objects in Native American history.
Mm-hmm.
And other kinds
Oh,
of maybe not just objects, sometimes remains. There are some laws about how those things need to be returned, but that can be kind of a gray area as well in terms of the history of the linkages between colonialism and exploitation and
Mm-hmm.
indigenous populations.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those cases, I think it's also important to try to establish collaborative relationships with tribal communities. And so for archivists and museums to go out and talk to tribal communities about what they should or shouldn't display.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes down to not only objects, but also just there's some sort of sacred manuals and things like that I know that some tribal communities are not happy about being.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one case where I think limiting access to researchers, tribal communities should be consulted. In most other cases, I think having some access, but flagging and contextualizing access is important.
Mm-hmm.
Which is much more of a challenge these days when everything can just immediately pop up on the internet.
Yeah. Well, we're getting short on time already. I think I kind of want to do this for just, if you could just briefly, because I know that this is being recorded, it will be sent out to librarians across the state. Can you just briefly summarize the legislation that is currently before the Arkansas
Yeah. I think I know it kind
He's
of
got it by heart.
legislature?
10 pages now.
So there's a bill that's being entertained before the House Judiciary Committee soon. It's passed through the Senate. It's Senate Bill 81. It regards obscene materials, making a new law about harmful to minors, and then amending some other parts of the library code. There's 6 sections. The first one, most libraries don't really have an issue with. It's creating a new crime in Arkansas called furnishing a harmful item to a minor, failure to report. A lot of this section of the bill actually just aligns some of the state standards with the Miller test. So it just makes it more clear that there's a process to challenge something, that it defines these terms and it points it to the right section of Arkansas code, so there's no real issue there. Section 2 was concerning the defense for claims of obscenity. For a long time, libraries, museum workers, and school employees have had a protection in Arkansas law against claims of obscenity. So it's due process. It's saying you can't go and arrest the county librarian or go into a school and arrest a school librarian because someone has claimed that something is obscene. That part totally made sense. They've changed that section of the law now to where it says no employee or director of a museum shall be arrested for things that have been determined to be obscene. So the way that the language is written now in the law is it legalizes judicially determined obscenity as long as it's in a museum. And we tried to point this out to them when they were drafting the bill and when they were voting on it, but of course they just take public input and it's their prerogative to write whatever bills or pass whatever bills they want to do. Section 3 just redefines, or it doesn't even redefine, it just confirms that if something is judicially determined obscenity, that you're guilty of a crime if you give it out to people. I mean, I'm not going to do that. I don't know of any library that would. Section 4 and 5 create a new challenge process for the public to challenge library materials in a school in Section 4 and Section 5 for public libraries. This is one that I think anybody who cares about freedom of speech should talk to their elected officials and make sure that they understand what this section of the bill does. It creates a committee to review materials that are challenged, and the committee has to apply what those constitutional tests are that we talked about earlier, the Miller test, and then make a determination on whether the material is appropriate for a library or not. But then it takes it one step further and says if you don't like what the library board decided or the committee, that you can take it to elected officials who can then make a determination on whether it stays in the library or not, but they don't have to use the same test. Like they can just take the reports that the library put together, take the advice of the executive of the city or county, so a city mayor or a county judge, and then they can make a determination on whether it needs to stay in the library or not, based on their personal opinions. That's the part of the bill that I think is the hardest pill to swallow. And then the last section, Section 6, changes confidentiality of library patron records to make it to where a parent can see what's on their kid's library card. When we were talking about this bill with the folks who were drafting the legislation, we talked about a compromise of maybe saying, codify in there that libraries are allowed to have a family card. So that way you have a balance there. A 5-year-old has a book checked out on their account. Of course you want to be able to tell their parents what it is, because 9 times out of 10, they've lost it somewhere in the house and they need to know which book it is. So as Arkansas code is currently written, we cannot tell parents what's on their kids' cards regardless of their age. So even if it is a nonverbal 1-year-old, you can't tell the parent what's on the kid's card, which is a bit absurd. Of course, you can once it goes overdue. That's in the law. But now the law says that you can just tell any parent what's on their kid's account, up to and including teenagers. And that does have ramifications for universities, especially if they have concurrent credit students, or if they have students who are under the age of 18. So your parents could come in, if you're under 18, they say, I want to know what's on my kid's library account at the university, and by law, we have to tell them.
Yeah, that was always, that right to privacy was always protected before.
Yeah. So for school libraries though, it's a little, I don't know, gray, I guess. At this point, FERPA, the federal law where a parent can know what a minor's educational record is. And so Arkansas is not one of the states. There are some states that have said specifically school library records are part of the educational, their reporting. And so most of our school librarians in our state have agreed with our school boards that a minor under 17 would be able, it would be part of their educational record. But I don't know, that's not a law. It's just a little bit gray. So most school libraries do go through that, but especially if it's overdue, you know, if a parent calls and says, what is it? I'm going to look on the kid's shelf. That's, yeah, so it's a little murky for us.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing that. So right now, are there obscene materials in Arkansas libraries, public
No.
libraries, in school libraries?
No.
Academic libraries? No? That's a federal definition.
Yeah. Obscenity is illegal. You can't purchase obscene materials on the open market. So anything you purchase from Barnes & Noble or Amazon or a library book vendor is by its own being, it is not an obscene item. If it were, and I think this is lost on the folks who have written this bill, if any of those materials were obscene, they already would have been challenged and they already would be out of libraries, because you can file suit against a book. I mean, you can do it right now. It's already in Arkansas code that you can take it to a prosecuting attorney in your county. The prosecuting attorney will take it to circuit court, and circuit court makes a determination on whether it's obscene or not. And these books that are on library shelves have been there forever. The one that everybody seems to be up in arms about is a kid's sex ed book called It's Perfectly Normal. And it talks in very frank terms about bits and parts and where they go and what they do. And it's got drawings in there of how it works. And for a lot of kids, that's an important book to have. I don't know if it was Aaron who relayed this story or if it was another one of our colleagues was talking about how they had a pregnant teenager at their school and became an aide of the library. And one of these books came across the desk and they said, you know, if I'd have read this book when I was younger, I wouldn't be a teenage mom. So, I mean, it's important information to have out there. And if that book was obscene, somebody would have taken it to court by now and it would have been determined to be obscene. The issue is with this bill is that they don't like the answer that they get from circuit court, which that is the avenue of how you challenge books. They want to bypass the judiciary and give that decision to elected officials who don't have the constitutional background or training to understand that that material is protected.
All right. Well, I'd like to open it up to all of you for questions for the panel. So I can ask, we've got lots of questions we can ask still, so. But it'd be nice to get, you know, perspectives out there. Questions you have? Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in the law that is dated, right, or has been around for a very long time and maybe just hasn't been removed yet. So are there books out there that were ruled to be obscene in earlier eras that are still considered to be obscene? I mean, somebody gave the example of Ulysses earlier, and I was thinking, you know, I'm not sure how anybody could get far enough into that book to figure out whether it's obscene or not, right? Because it's so unwieldy, right? But are there books that you're aware of that modern sensibility might not see as obscene that are still unavailable to the public?
I can't think of any that come to mind. I know there were some early challenges to not so much obscene materials, which obscene specifically talks about sexual interest, but there have been books that were banned by courts that were anti-war books in the 1940s and 1950s that were determined by courts that now those are un-American, you can't have those books in libraries. But as far as obscene books, I mean, they must have hid those in library school where we weren't able to look at them.
Publishers can't publish them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about the money is always a piece of this whole deal. We purchase books from publishers. They've already gone through pretty extensive editing and review. And librarians are trained to look for the books that have been well reviewed, right? We're not gonna waste people's money on trashy books. So it's part and parcel.
And where you get kind of close to that line on, let's say, a book like 50 Shades of Grey, I couldn't keep that book in my library.
Yeah.
And it was so funny watching people check it out because it was like me when I was a kid trying to sneak into the back room of the video store, you know? Like you'd have old ladies coming up, like looking at the ground, have the book upside down and slide across the thing. And It's their right to read that if they want to. Go nuts.
Okay, so my principal came getting into my library one day. I had 6th and 7th graders, mind you. Miss Shaw, did you just check out 50 Shades of Grey to Hannah? And I was like, what? She said, yeah, she's in the hallway. She's showing all of her friends. I said, that was called Between Shades of Grey by Rita Sepetys, which is a historical fiction book. I said, do you honestly think I would have 50 Shades of Grey in our library? She was like, well, I didn't think so, but I mean, like, she flung that door open and came marching in. I was like, yee, I'm in trouble. But yeah, so Hannah thought she had 50 Shades of Grey. They were all, 7th graders were all looking at it. Have fun with that one.
I bet that title made a lot of money.
So
Unexpectedly.
if Rita Sepetys, she came for one of our library conferences and she said she had great sales based on that. But of course, like it's a great historical fiction of World War II of stories that I didn't know. I didn't know about Lithuania and what were they were all, I don't know, targeted by, I don't know, I read it. It was great, but I learned a new piece of history, but it was not 50 Shades of Grey. Those kids.
Yeah.
I'll ask. What is your perspective on spine labeling on books like in children's department? And I'm talking about subjective labels.
I think it's a bad, well, like I said, my little YA stickers, I put one on Sharon Draper's Battle of Jericho. Didn't have sex, drugs, or rock and roll in it, but the kids were checking it out because of that. So, you know, I think about that, and I've even talked to a couple of gay friends of mine, and I was like, so should I have put labels on and they were like, no, that's a terrible idea. And you know, because I thought about it and I was like, well, maybe I should. I don't know. So I don't know what you think. I know a lot of ours, they do genre labels. They all want to genreify the libraries, but then they can't.
But beyond genre, more
Yeah.
subjective,
Just
like a rainbow or whatever.
right.
I won't do it.
No, I don't either.
I don't think
do it,
it's a
though
good
I
idea
wanted to know
either.
what your opinion was on it.
Anything that we do as far as labeling materials or cataloging is to help a person find the material that they're looking for. And I've had this request at my library a couple of times to put a rainbow sticker on every book that has a gay character in it.
Yeah.
I think that would include the Bible, depending on your view of U.S. presidential history. It might include biographies about Millard Fillmore or Rufus Devane King. But I don't think anybody is looking for books in the library. Say, you know what, I want books that just mention that there are gay people in the world. I mean, that's like saying I want you to label books with people who have shoes on with a shoe sticker. You know, it's just an arbitrary thing that's in a book. It's just part of life. You know, gay people live on the same planet as the rest of us, and to put a sticker on there as a means of deterring people from those materials, I think at that point, you're opening the door to put a sticker on anything that anybody finds objectionable, and you won't be able to see the title of the book because it'll just be stickers from top to bottom.
So, you talked about intellectual freedom being inherently American. So what worries you about the future of intellectual freedom? Obviously, I think we're in a concerning moment, but does it erode intellectual freedom as an American value in the future? What does it do to the, future of intellectual freedom in this country?
Anybody? Thank you. The second you start hiding pieces of history, I think when people find out later, I don't know about the rest of you, I don't like being lied to. I don't like feeling like I've been lied to. And here's a little bit of Arkansas history for everybody. Have any of you ever stayed at Camp Tanaco in Hot Springs? It's a Christian summer camp. Great. You know that the bunks at Camp Tanaco are government surplus from the Rower internment camp in South Arkansas. I didn't even know what the Rower internment camp was until I was an adult, and I grew up pretty close to that area. And to feel like I grew up with this story of American history and that we were 100% the good guys in World War II. And I believe in a lot of that because, I grew up going to VFW with my grandpa, and all of him and his brothers and cousins were all vets. And then to find out as an adult that we have these parts of our history that are shameful, but we need to learn lessons from them, it made me upset as an adult that someone didn't think that I, as a teenager, as a kid, was emotionally mature enough to understand that. We had a documentary at the Documentary Film Fest this last year about reading Rainbow, and they were talking about they workshopped one of the books that they were going to show on Reading Rainbow for kids, and it was a really tough topic. It was about a kid with cancer. And so they showed it in front of a focus group, and they were like, we're really worried about these kids, mental well-being and things by showing them this book. So they showed it ahead of time before they put it on the show, and the kids, when they were interviewed afterwards, were just like, that's just something that happens in the world. The kids they're not these fragile eggs. Like, kids are pretty resilient, and they put up with a lot of stuff. We see it a lot in public libraries when you have kids come in who smell like meth, or come in with no parents or no shoes on in 40-degree weather. These kids go through stuff, and the library needs to have material that deal with tough topics for those kids. Not everything in the library is for everyone. I know Aaron talked about every book their reader and every reader their book, but not everything in the library is for everyone. So as far as intellectual freedom goes, I think the second we start hiding stuff and we start taking out parts of our culture, that it just makes it an unstable base, and it makes it more difficult for us to move forward as a society.
Anything to add, John?
Well, I mean,
What makes you stay up at night?
I think broadly speaking, just sort of like if we think about intellectual freedom as being part of like a democratic society, just a decline of even people's interest in like the public good, and libraries as like an anchor of the public good from a place where a kid who has problems at home might find refuge to a place where somebody might learn something. So there's that aspect of it, and then just broadly speaking, like a lack of historical literacy. And along those lines, when you start kind of shaping the grooves of like what you should and shouldn't learn, the extent to which like white nationalist historical interpretations have just become much more mainstream, and they get facilitated by social media. I thought it was really interesting when you're talking about the difference between challenges to books now versus back in Harry Potter days. I would say those three things: just a decline of interest in the public good, a lack of historical literacy in all veins of American history, the good and the bad, and then the way that white nationalist historical interpretations have become more mainstream.
Well, we are past time. It's 5:08. Maybe if there's one more question, if we had somebody who's just, want to.
What can people do to help?
Yes, excellent question.
Get involved. Don't sit on the sidelines and hope that somebody will swoop in. You're the folks who will change this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And vote.
Yes.
Because this is happening because of the people who are representing Arkansas. And we have more power than we know. We have a lot of power in that vote. So, yes.
Yeah, and don't vote party line anymore. Let's look at the actual candidate
Yeah.
and find out. Somebody is mad at librarians and libraries right now, but it's going to mushroom, especially in the school, because a school library, I know all of our classrooms had libraries for kids. If they couldn't get down, right now we have the science of reading. Everybody is supposed to be reading. Well, if you can't get into the library, all of the teachers have their own little classroom libraries. So is this going to affect them? And, it's this giant mushroom cloud. And then I think about libraries from a historical perspective. they weren't for everybody at first. They were only for the people who could read. And they were very exclusive. And now we finally have made them inclusive. But now we want to take out all of these different pieces and not give access to all of the stories and the perspectives. So, yeah, go to your library. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
I want to know how many of those legislators have walked into a school library. Like I want them to find an obscene material. I keep asking that. And I don't know who's been in a library lately, but I asked my own kid, he's 15. I was like, have you ever seen an obscene material in your library? And he was like, no, Mom. But it's not like he's checking books out or reading anyway. He's 15. I'm trying.
All right, well, again, thank you to the panelists.